Hey, tonight we're traveling back to the very beginning, the so-called cradle of civilization. But don't expect enlightenment and peace. Ancient Mesopotamia, for all its historic glory, was a land where suffering was routine, power was absolute, and fairness was more of a myth than a reality. You may have heard of towering ziggurats, mysterious clay tablets, and golden rivers. But behind that shimmering surface lies a world of harsh rules, unrelenting labor, and constant fear. If you're enjoying these quiet journeys into the past, I'd truly appreciate a like or a quick subscribe. It really helps more than you know. And if you're still awake, I'd love to hear where in the world you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now, take a deep breath, let the day melt away, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's drift together into a time long, long ago, to a land of mud brick cities, mighty rivers, and merciless laws. Welcome to ancient Mesopotamia. The good news: you've just woken up at the dawn of human civilization. The bad news: you're about to find out that progress came at a terrible price. Your eyes flutter open, and you're immediately hit by the suffocating warmth of your family's tiny mud brick home. There's no bed, just a rough mat of woven reeds, and no privacy, because you're sharing this small space with half a dozen family members, siblings, parents, maybe even grandparents, all cramped together in a single room that smells faintly of sweat, smoke, and dust. There's no window to open. There's barely a door, just a woven curtain hanging over a rectangular hole in the wall. Congratulations! You're a lower-class worker in the city of Uruk around 3000 BCE. And your destiny was sealed the moment you were born. Your family status, your job, even the punishments you'd receive if you stepped out of line, all predetermined, with little chance of change. There are no rags to riches stories here. If your father was a laborer, you're a laborer. If your mother was a servant, so are you. Upward mobility wasn't just rare, it was nearly impossible. There are priests and kings who rule above you, and they claim divine authority. You don't dare question them. Even your thoughts must obey. The gods, they say, have decreed this order, and to resist it is to bring ruin on yourself and your family. Fairness? That's a word that doesn't translate well into Sumerian. As the sun rises over the plains of Mesopotamia, you drag your tired body to the city center, careful not to step on sharp stones or broken pottery along the way. Every step is deliberate. Not because you're afraid of falling, but because a single misstep in behavior can ruin your life. Towering over the public square is a giant slab of black basalt, the Code of Hammurabi. Inscribed on it are nearly 300 laws, each etched in painstaking detail, with one thing in common. The punishments are brutal, and there's no mercy for the poor. Eye for an eye, only if you're of equal status. If a noble kills a poor man, he pays a fine. If you, a peasant, strike a noble, that might cost you your hand or your head. You look up at the stone, trying to decipher the cuneiform symbols you'll never fully understand. You never learn to read. That was a privilege reserved for scribes and elites. But you've heard the laws shouted in the market. If a builder constructs a house and it collapses, killing the owner's son, then the builder's son is executed. Not the builder, his son. Fairness? You start to realize that fairness is a luxury, not a right. And forget about appealing to a judge. Courts weren't about truth. They were about who had power, who could bribe the priest judge, and who had more witnesses willing to lie. If you're poor, the best outcome is silence. If you speak up, you'd better have a dozen friends to vouch for you. Or else prepare for the whipping post. There is no such thing as sleeping in. The sky is barely light, and already your father is shouting. You have to haul water from the canal, tend the goats, patch the reed fences, and deliver sacks of barley to the granary. All before the city bell signals midday. There's no breakfast waiting. Maybe a bit of dried bread if rats haven't gotten to it first. And then it's out into the fields. Mesopotamian agriculture is the backbone of the city, and your personal prison. The Tigris and Euphrates, rivers flood unpredictably. Sometimes they destroy everything. Sometimes they leave behind rich silt. But every season, you're out there, knee-deep in mud, swinging a wooden hoe under the blazing sun. You have no shoes. Your skin burns, blisters, and peels. The irrigation canals must be cleared by hand. The oxen are stubborn, and the overseer, with a whip, is always watching. You want to rest? There's no time. If you slow down, you get fewer rations. And no food means no life. You hear about scribes and merchants who live easier lives. Soft hands, clean clothes, even beer at lunch. But that's not your world. Your job is to survive until you can't anymore. And in this world, the average life expectancy hovers somewhere between 30 and 40. And that's if you don't die from an infected cut, heat stroke, or starvation first. As you slump back to your home after hours of labor in the fields, you might hope for some kind of comfort. A cool room, a soft cushion, maybe a moment to yourself. But comfort, in Mesopotamia, is for the gods and kings, not for you. Your house is made of sun-dried mud bricks, the cheapest and most available building material in the land between the rivers. It's the same stuff that lines the streets, builds the temples, and crumbles beneath every storm. These bricks are stacked with only reed mats and tar for waterproofing. But they're not really waterproof. When the rains come, and oh they will, water seeps into the walls, turns them to mush, and threatens to collapse the entire structure if you don't constantly repair it. The floor? Dirt. The windows? Bare slits in the wall, or none at all, to keep out dust storms. But without airflow, your home turns into a clay oven under the sun. The roof is flat and covered in straw, maybe used for sleeping in the summer. If you're not afraid of snakes, mosquitoes, or the occasional rooftop collapse, furniture is rare. You might have a mat, a low bench, or a few clay pots. If you're lucky, a woven basket or two. And yet, this space isn't just your home. It's your kitchen, your storage shed, your bedroom, and your shelter. There's no chimney. Smoke from your cooking fire just fills the room and slowly leaks out through the ceiling. Your lungs burn, your eyes water, and the scent of burnt barley, goat fat, and clay smoke clings to everything you own, including your skin. It's not the aroma of home, it's the odor of survival. And as night falls, the heat of the day turns into a damp chill. There are no blankets, no insulation, no warmth beyond body heat. If a storm rolls in, the roof may leak or even collapse, but you'll still lie there, eyes closed, stomach aching, and pray that the walls hold until morning. You might think the gods are watching over you, protecting you from harm. But in ancient Mesopotamia, the gods don't protect. They demand. And their temples, they're not just places of worship. They're the banks, the landlords, the employers, and the tax collectors. And they take more than they give. As a commoner, you're expected to work a portion of your time for the temple. This isn't volunteer work, it's mandatory. One day you're hoeing barley fields for the priesthood. The next you're hauling stone for the ziggurats expansion project, and if you refuse, you're punished, not by the gods, but by the priests' enforcers. The temple owns vast swaths of land. It controls irrigation, trade, and grain storage. Every harvest, a portion of your crops, usually the best portion, must be tithed to the gods. But the gods don't eat, the priests do, and the rest is stored in temple granaries, which conveniently also loan grain back to you during bad years. Of course, you'll owe interest in grain, labor, or worse, your land. And it doesn't stop there. The temple owns livestock, workshops, even brewers and bakers. You may be paid in rations, but those rations come from what you produced after the temple took its cut. You're essentially renting your life back from the gods. But the rent keeps rising, and you can't ever leave. If you're in debt, and most people are, you could be forced into temple slavery. Not chains and whips, but bondage by obligation. You keep working and working and working. You wear a collar that shows you're a debt slave. Your children inherit the debt if you die. You pray the gods will save you, even as they're earthly. Servants extract every last drop of your strength. Temples in Mesopotamia were grand, yes, towering structures of awe and splendor. But beneath their gleaming facades, they were machinery, grinding, humming, devouring, built on your sweat, fed with your grain, and blind to your suffering. Let's say you make it through the fields, the temple duties, and another night on the roof without falling off. You wake up the next morning, coughing. Your throat is raw, your chest tight. Maybe it's just the smoke. Maybe it's something worse. In ancient Mesopotamia, disease wasn't a rare misfortune. It was a constant companion. There's no understanding of germs, no soap, no concept of sanitation. Sewage runs in open canals through the streets. People dump waste into the same river they drink from. Flies breed in stagnant water and hover over food left uncovered in the heat. Your drinking water, pulled from a muddy stream, may be strained through cloth, but likely shared with livestock and waste runoff. Toilet facilities, at best, a clay pot emptied into a trench. At worst, wherever's convenient. Feces attracts flies, flies spread disease, and disease spreads faster than a whispered rumor. Diarrhea, dysentery, typhoid, and fevers. They cut through families, like harvest sickles. And if you fall seriously ill, the options are terrifying. You might be treated by a healer, someone who reads omens, burns incense, and chants incantations to drive out evil spirits. It's spiritual medicine, not science. If that doesn't work, you might be offered remedies like crushed lizard, bones, beer mixed with garlic, or sheep dung poultices. That's if you're lucky. If you're poor, you just stay home and wait. Child mortality is tragically high. Many women die during childbirth, bleeding out on a dirt floor surrounded by frightened family. Babies who survive the first week are considered fortunate. The rest? Quietly buried under the floor of the home. Life expectancy hovers in the 30s. And that's assuming you don't get infected, enslaved, or punished for something you didn't do. And yet, despite the death and dirt, life marches on. People wake up, go to work, give offerings to the gods, sweep their crumbling homes, sing lullabies to children they know might not see adulthood. In Mesopotamia, you don't live, you endure. You might think that laws are meant to protect the weak, to ensure fairness, to punish only the guilty. But in ancient Mesopotamia, justice wasn't blind, it was brutal. It was public, and it favored the powerful. Welcome to the world of Hammurabi's Code, one of the oldest legal systems in human history. Carved into stone for all to see, it was the king's way of showing authority and making fear a daily companion. But these laws weren't about rehabilitation, they were about retaliation, and often revenge. Break another man's bone? Yours is broken in return. Put out his eye? Prepare to lose your own. But be careful. This balance only applies if both people are of the same class. If a nobleman breaks the bone of a poor man, he pays a fine. If a poor man strikes a noble, he could be flogged, mutilated, or executed. The law didn't weigh actions equally. It weighed people. And then there are the truly terrifying clauses. If a builder's house collapses and kills the owner's son, then the builder's own son is put to death. Not the builder, his innocent child. In the logic of the time, this wasn't injustice. It was balance. A life for a life, even if the wrong person paid the price. Accused of theft. You might be drowned to see if the gods would save you. Suspected of sorcery. Burned alive. Did you speak out against a priest or tax collector? That's slander, punishable by whipping or facial mutilation. And if you're a woman, things only get worse. A wife accused of adultery could be tied and thrown in the river. If she survived, the gods had judged her innocent. If she didn't, well, there wouldn't be a second trial. In this world, law was not protection. It was a tool of control. You didn't challenge it, you feared it, and every clay tablet, every carved edict reminded you of your place. and how quickly justice could become a death sentence. If you think childhood meant carefree days and playful afternoons, forget it. In ancient Mesopotamia, childhood was over before it began. By age 5, children were already part of the labor force. Boys followed their fathers into the fields, learning to plow, irrigate, and herd. Girls helped their mothers grind grain, fetch water, weave cloth, and tend fire. There were no toys, no schools for the poor, and no safety nets. Every small hand was a tool, every young back another body to carry the burden of survival. Education, that was a privilege reserved for the sons of scribes, nobles, and temple officials. And it wasn't fun. The tablet schools, known as adubus, were strict, often terrifying places. Students memorized cuneiform symbols by pressing reeds into wet clay, hour after hour, day after day. Teachers carried sticks, and disobedience or error could earn you a beating. You weren't nurtured, you were drilled. Rote repetition, strict discipline, no questions asked. But most children didn't learn to read or write. Most couldn't afford to. Instead, they were married off young. Girls as early as 12, boys as young as 15. Marriages were arranged, dowries negotiated, and once wed, a girl became the property of her husband's household. She might bear children of her own before she fully understood what childhood even was. And disease, always lurking, meant many children never reached adulthood. A simple fever, a gut infection, or even malnutrition could claim a child in days. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no second chances. Losing a child was common, expected even. Families sometimes didn't even name their children until they survived their first year. In Mesopotamia, innocence wasn't protected. It was burned away by labor, loss, and duty. Childhood wasn't a season of life. It was a brief shadow, quickly swallowed by the harsh demands of a brutal world. Now, let's turn our gaze to the women of ancient Mesopotamia. The mothers, daughters, wives, priestesses, slaves. If you imagine they lived lives of quiet dignity behind the walls of their homes, think again. Their reality was far more complicated and far more controlled. A woman's life was shaped entirely by the men around her, her father, her husband, her son. She couldn't inherit land. She couldn't divorce without his consent. She couldn't walk freely in the market without risking suspicion. Her role was to serve, in the home, in the temple, or in silence. Her day began before the sun, grinding barley on a stone slab, fetching water from the river, tending fires that filled the air with choking smoke, then kneading bread, washing clothes, and spinning wool, all by hand, all without pause. And after the labor, obedience, always obedience. Marriage wasn't a romantic affair, it was a transaction. She was part of a contract with clauses for fertility, fidelity, and household productivity. If she bore no children, particularly no sons, her position became fragile. Her husband might take another wife, or send her away, or worse. And yet, not all Mesopotamian women were voiceless. Some served as priestesses, or worked as brewers, midwives, or weavers. A rare few ran businesses or owned taverns. In temple roles, especially as naditus, celibate women dedicated to the gods, they could wield surprising power. But even then, their lives belonged to the institution, never to themselves. Adultery laws were harsh, but not equally. A man could sleep with slaves or concubines without consequence. A woman caught even in suspicion faced drowning, stoning, or public humiliation. Her body was not her own. Her fate was not her choice. And yet, amid this control, there were moments of strength, of resistance, songs composed by female temple poets, clay figurines shaped by women's hands, prayers whispered to goddesses like Inanna, begging for mercy, fertility, or vengeance. They may have lived beneath layers of dust, law, and silence, but their lives were not forgotten, and neither is their strength. You might think religion in ancient Mesopotamia was about personal faith or quiet prayer, something spiritual, something uplifting. But here, religion was survival. The Mesopotamians didn't worship their gods out of love. They feared them, because the gods weren't merciful. They weren't patient. They were petty, violent, and always watching. Forget to leave an offering, and a storm might destroy your crops. Say the wrong prayer, and your child might fall ill. The gods needed constant praise, constant feeding, constant sacrifice. Or else, every city had its patron deity. In Uruk, it was Inanna, goddess of love and war. In Nippur, Enlil, lord of the wind. In Eridu, the god Enki ruled the waters. But none of them were comforting. These gods had human flaws: jealousy, vengeance, greed, and their divine tantrums shaped your daily life. Temples weren't just holy sites, they were economic engines, granaries, workshops, and centers of political power. And who supported them? You did, through offerings, taxes, and labor. Part of your harvest went to the temple. A portion of your fish, your livestock, even your children, especially your daughters, if they were chosen to serve as temple attendants. Religious festivals? Sounds fun, right? Not exactly. They meant long processions under the burning sun, days of fasting, ceremonial duties that took you away from your work and your rest. Refusing to participate wasn't an option. It was heresy. And then there were the omens. Every sneeze, every dream, every strange cloud formation was a message from the gods. If a goat gave birth to a two-headed kid, the priest would have to perform emergency rituals, and you might be forced to take part. You could spend hours, even days, repenting for signs you didn't understand, trying to appease divine forces you could never predict. In Mesopotamia, religion was not a comfort. It was a duty, a fear, a never-ending pressure to keep cosmic chaos at bay. And in a world where drought, flood, or invasion could strike at any time, no one dared let their guard down, not even in their sleep. Imagine waking up one morning with a slight fever and a sore throat. In our world, you'd probably rest, take medicine, maybe see a doctor. But in ancient Mesopotamia, that fever could be your death sentence. There were no hospitals, no doctors in the modern sense, just priests and healers, part medicine man, part magician, trying to chase away evil spirits with incantations, herbs, and sacrifices. Because sickness wasn't biological here, it was spiritual. If you were ill, it meant the gods were angry, or a demon had taken hold of your body. The cure: recite spells while rubbing tree resin on your skin, bury a cursed figurine in the river, smear oil over your chest while chanting to Nergal, god of plague, and hope the fever breaks before it reaches your lungs or your brain. Infections from a simple cut could spiral into gangrene. There were no antiseptics, no soap, no knowledge of germs. Surgeons, if you can call them that, worked with bronze tools, without anesthesia. Bloodletting was common. So was drilling into the skull to release evil winds from the brain. And the worst part, you weren't just a patient, you were a burden. If you stayed sick too long, your family might be forced to abandon you. In some cities, the ill were left in temples to die quietly or be healed by divine will. Children with fevers were often carried to riverbanks for ritual cleansing, but many didn't come back. Epidemics swept through crowded cities like fire through dry grass. With no sewage systems, filth piled up. Flies, rats, contaminated water, all of it breeding disease. Measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, parasites. They didn't just weaken you. They erased families, ended lineages, emptied villages. Even childbirth, the most natural of acts, was a high-risk gamble. Women died from infections, bleeding, or obstructed labor, and babies often didn't survive the week. Midwives could help, but they too relied on amulets and prayers. There was no healing without fear, no medicine without magic. and no guarantee you'd ever wake up feeling better. In Mesopotamia, sickness wasn't a season, it was a shadow, one that could fall over your life at any moment. The ancient Mesopotamian cities may have had walls, but they were never safe. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates, fertile, rich, and desirable, was also a crossroads of conflict. There were always enemies, always someone hungry for what you had. Akkadians, Gutians, Elamites, Assyrians, Amorites, Hittites. Your neighbor today could be your conqueror tomorrow. Kings rose and fell like dust in the wind. Empires expanded, then shattered. And in between, the people, you, lived in fear. The nights were the worst. You'd lie on your mat, staring at the reed ceiling, listening. Dogs barking, wind blowing, or worse, silence. The kind that meant soldiers were coming. Raiders didn't knock. They arrived with fire, with spears, with no mercy. Your livestock would be stolen, your house torched, your children dragged off. And if you were lucky, if you survived, you'd be taken as a slave, forced to build someone else's ziggurat in a land you'd never seen. And when the empires clashed, the destruction was total. Temples looted, canals sabotaged, crops burned. The Sumerians once described cities turned to mounds of corpses, where no one walks. That was the reality. Even your own kings might turn on you, draft you into armies, seize your grain for the war effort, or relocate your family entirely. The Assyrians perfected this, conquering a city, then forcibly resettling its people hundreds of miles away to break their spirit. There was no Geneva Convention, no safe zones. War wasn't politics, it was terror, and you could never predict when it would arrive, so you slept lightly, if you slept at all, and prayed, not for peace, but simply to survive another sunrise. If you're imagining Mesopotamian childhood as a time of carefree play and wonder, let's correct that now. Childhood, as we know it today, full of toys, learning, and parental protection, simply didn't exist here. Not in the way you'd hope. You weren't a child. You were a small worker in training. The moment you could carry something heavier than a clay tablet, you were useful. That might be age 6 or 5 or even 4. No one waited for birthdays. In a farming village, you'd be helping till soil, fetch water, or chase goats before your front teeth were done growing in. In the city, maybe your family made bricks. And guess who helped mold mud under the blazing sun? You. Girls. Their fate was often decided at birth. If they survived infancy, many didn't. They were expected to grow into mothers as quickly as possible. Betrothals could happen at age 10 or 11. By 12, some girls were married. By 13, many were pregnant. Education was rare and reserved mostly for boys from elite families. Even then, it wasn't easy. You'd rise before dawn, walk to the Aduba, the tablet house, and spend hours memorizing Sumerian or Akkadian script by scratching wedge-shaped symbols into wet clay. The teacher, often a priest, was strict. Corporal punishment wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged. Students wrote about being whipped for errors. Imagine your math homework coming with a side of bruises. And for most children, there was no school at all. Just work. Endless, tiring, adult responsibilities. There were toys, yes, little whistles, dolls, or spinning tops, but they were scraps of leisure in a life that demanded labor. You might catch a brief moment of joy watching a beetle crawl or making a reed boat to float down the canal. But fun? That was never the point. Children were expected to contribute, to grow fast, to endure, because life didn't wait, and it didn't forgive weakness. In Mesopotamia, there was no weekend, no day off, no concept of leisure. There was only the next task, and then the next. From the moment the sky began to brighten over the ziggurats, and the reeds whispered in the canals, your day began, and it didn't end until darkness swallowed everything. Time was sacred. But it didn't belong to you. It belonged to the gods, the king, and the land. If you were a laborer, and most people were, you rose before the sun. The rooster might crow, but you didn't need it. Your body was already trained to wake with dread. You dressed quickly, in your coarse linen or wool, ate a scrap of flatbread or porridge if it was available, and joined the others. Fields had to be ploughed, ditches dug, clay hauled, bricks stacked, water fetched. If you worked for a temple, and many did, you might be assigned to repair canal walls or carry supplies from storage chambers. Some workers were assigned to press oil from olives, grind grain into flour, or pound copper with hammers in stifling forges. None of this was optional. The state recorded your labor. Temples had foremen who kept clay records of every task, every ration, every day missed. If you skipped work, you weren't just lazy, you were guilty. You might lose your grain allotment, or your home. Even the sun itself judged you. In Mesopotamian thought, Utu, the sun god, was the god of justice. He saw all. And he expected you to work while he watched. Breaks? Maybe a few. Meals were brief. Water had to be rationed. And if you complained too much, well, there were always slaves, debtors, or prisoners to take your place. When the day finally ended and the shadows grew long, you returned home, aching, filthy, and exhausted. You might eat a lentil stew, sit in silence, and collapse onto a mat on the dirt floor. And then, just like that, it would be time to do it all again. In Mesopotamia, time didn't heal, it harvested. In our world, we imagine death as a gateway, peaceful, mysterious, maybe even beautiful. In Mesopotamia, it was a trap. You lived in a world where death didn't just haunt the old. It claimed children, mothers in childbirth, farmers struck by heat stroke, soldiers pierced by spears, and beggars with nothing left but breath. And when it came, it wasn't the end of suffering. Mesopotamians didn't believe in a shining heaven. No harp-strumming angels. No golden gates. Instead, the dead descended into the Kur, a dark, dusty underworld beneath the earth. A bleak, joyless place filled with spirits eating dry dirt and sipping muddy water. No matter how good or bad you were in life, you went there. Everyone did. The best you could hope for was a proper burial. If your body wasn't buried correctly, if no one performed the rituals or left offerings, your spirit could become a giddim, a restless ghost. These ghosts wandered the streets, tormented the living, and brought sickness to families. They were feared, and rightly so. Funerals were sacred and precise. Incantations were chanted. Food and water were left at the grave to keep the dead from growing angry. Families poured libations down clay tubes that fed into the tomb. Yes, literal straws to the underworld. A thirsty ancestor was a dangerous one. But even if buried properly, the afterlife was a grey prison. The land of no return, they called it. A place where spirits crouched in darkness, whispering memories of sunlight. There were no rewards, no redemption. That's why Mesopotamians obsessed over legacy, over children, over monuments and names etched in clay, because they believed that only the living could protect the dead, by remembering them. If you were forgotten, your soul might dissolve, a second death, a worse one. So people clung to life. Not because it was easy, but because the alternative was worse. If you think modern laws are strict, you've clearly never run afoul of Hammurabi. In Mesopotamia, there wasn't a police force the way we know it today. Justice was swift, public, and brutal. And if you made one wrong move, especially against someone richer, more powerful, or just luckier than you, the results could be horrifying. The famous Code of Hammurabi, etched in black basalt and still preserved today, wasn't written with compassion in mind. It was written with control. And its motto might as well have been, "Don't mess up." Stole a goat, your hand might be chopped off. Destroyed a neighbour's crops, you'd owe them tenfold. or face being beaten in the city square, accused of theft or sorcery. Good luck. You might be thrown into the river to let the gods decide. If you floated, you were innocent, but probably freezing and traumatized. If you sank, well, they'd assume guilt after your body washed up. Oh, and let's talk about class. The punishments weren't the same for everyone. A nobleman who blinded a commoner, he might owe some silver, but a poor man who touched a noble's wife, he could be executed. Justice was tiered, and mercy was rare. Women had it even harder. Adultery could mean drowning. Speaking out could mean exile or worse. And a wife who failed to bear children, she might be discarded like broken pottery. Now imagine living in this world every day. Every interaction could spiral into disaster. One wrong word, one angry neighbor, one misunderstanding. You didn't need to be a criminal, just unlucky. And punishment wasn't just a deterrent, it was a spectacle. Done in front of crowds, watched by neighbors, etched into memory. In Mesopotamia, justice didn't wear a blindfold, it carried a blade. As the sun dipped beneath the dusty horizon and the golden light faded from the ziggurats, Mesopotamia transformed. Daytime was for sweat and toil. But night belonged to something else. The gods, the spirits, and the unseen things. Your oil lamp flickers. The shadows on the wall stretch and twist. You huddle on your sleeping mat, eyes wide open, listening to the moans of wind through mud-brick alleys. And you know, deep in your bones, something is awake out there. The Mesopotamians believed the world teemed with invisible forces. Benevolent gods, yes, but also demons, ghosts, and spirits that roamed after dark. And when the sun god Utu retired for the evening, his light no longer protected you. You'd recite prayers before bed, not just out of devotion, but out of fear. Protect me, Shamash. Guard me, Nergal. Keep Lamashtu away from my door. Who was Lamashtu? Only one of the most feared demons in Mesopotamian mythology. A night creature who preyed on pregnant women and infants. She crept through windows and snatched newborns from cradles. Amulets were hung above sleeping children to keep her out. Mothers kept a dagger nearby, just in case. And she wasn't alone. There was Pazuzu, the wind demon, bringer of drought and disease, sometimes summoned to fight greater evils. There were the Utuku, vengeful ghosts. The Edamu, spirits of those who died without proper burial. If you had wronged someone in life and didn't make it right, you could be haunted in dreams, cursed in sickness, or driven mad. So you lay in bed, eyes closed but not sleeping, hoping your roof doesn't leak, hoping no rat scurries over your legs, hoping your ancestors are pleased, and most of all, hoping that nothing visits. Because in Mesopotamia, night wasn't just the absence of light, it was the presence of power. And now we come to the lowest tier of Mesopotamian society, those who had no choice, no freedom, and often no names. Slaves. In the land that birthed writing and the wheel, not everyone shared in the glory. For many, life wasn't about building civilization. It was about surviving it. You could become a slave in many ways. Maybe you were captured in war. A soldier or civilian swept away by a conquering army. Maybe your family sold you to pay off a debt. Maybe you were born into it, the child of a slave mother, inheriting her status like a curse. Or perhaps you were punished, branded, and stripped of rights after committing a crime. Once enslaved, you had no autonomy. You didn't choose where you lived, what you wore, what you ate, or whether you'd see your family again. You might serve in a temple, grinding flour in the dark, humid kitchens. You might haul bricks for a government building. You might clean latrines for a rich merchant. Or worse, you could be sold as a concubine or domestic servant, traded like cattle. Some slaves had slightly better lives, managing estates or working in skilled crafts. But don't confuse that with comfort. They were still property. And even your freedom, if granted, wasn't truly yours. A master could free you by official decree, but society still viewed you with suspicion. Freed slaves had limited rights. You could be taken again in war. Your children could still be vulnerable, and the mark of servitude, literal or social, often lingered for life. Slavery wasn't an exception in Mesopotamia. It was built into the system, recorded on clay tablets, tracked by temple scribes, normalized in law. To be a slave in Mesopotamia was to wake each day knowing that your pain, your existence, enriched someone else, and the world was perfectly fine with that. You awaken to the distant rumble of water, and for a moment, it sounds almost peaceful. But this is Mesopotamia. And the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, beautiful, life-giving, and absolutely uncontrollable, are not your friends. These rivers didn't flood gently like the Nile. They surged, violently, unpredictably. One month they gave you rich silt and fish-filled currents. The next, they swallowed your house, your crops, and your entire village. No warning, no mercy, just water, brown, fast, and angry. There were no weather forecasts, no sandbag walls, no emergency management teams. When the water came, you grabbed what you could, maybe your child, a basket of grain, and you ran. If you were lucky. Many weren't. Entire cities were wiped out this way, towns rebuilt, only to be flattened again, over and over. Historians have found layers of flood debris in archaeological digs, like waterlogged time capsules of repeated tragedy. And yet, people stayed. Why? Because the rivers were everything. They watered the fields. They allowed boats to carry goods and soldiers. They made mud brick cities possible. The canals they fed were the veins of Mesopotamian agriculture, and the silt they left behind, when it didn't drown you, was black gold to a farmer. But survival meant eternal vigilance. Farmers rose before dawn to inspect irrigation ditches, clearing mud and reeds with bare hands. Too much water, and your barley drowned. Too little, and it withered into dust. A single broken canal gate could destroy an entire season. And if someone upstream hoarded water for their own fields, you'd beg the city official to intervene. Or worse, take matters into your own hands, sneaking through the reeds at night with a shovel and revenge in your heart. Water wars weren't metaphorical in Mesopotamia. They were real, bloody, and inevitable. The river was your god, your lifeline, and your executioner. You might think of a temple as a peaceful place, a sanctuary, a haven. But in Mesopotamia, temples were powerful, and they ran the show. Religion wasn't a weekend activity. It was baked into everything: politics, trade, law, birth, death, even farming, especially farming. The temple wasn't just where you prayed. It was where taxes were collected, where grain was stored, where orphans were raised, where slaves were bought, where contracts were signed, where punishments were decreed. It was also the largest employer in town. Temples owned land, lots of it. The ziggurat rising over the city skyline wasn't just a religious monument. It was the beating heart of Mesopotamian life. And the priests who ran it? They weren't humble servants of the gods. They were administrators, economists, judges, political powerhouses wrapped in linen robes. You might be a farmer, but you didn't own the land. The temple did, and you worked it, paying a portion of your harvest, your labor, your wool, your children, back to the gods. Even birth and marriage were temple-affiliated. Before you married, you might dedicate a lock of hair to Inanna. If you wanted children, you'd offer incense or a bronze figurine to Ninhursag. If your wife struggled in childbirth, a temple midwife might whisper spells and prayers over her swollen belly. And if your child died, you buried them with amulets, recited hymns, and hoped the priest would mention their name in rituals, so their soul wouldn't wander. Some girls were dedicated to the temple for life, trained as priestesses, scribes, or musicians. Others, less fortunate, might be sacred prostitutes, a practice debated by scholars but recorded in multiple texts. The temple controlled not just your wealth, but your fate, and it wasn't optional. Skipping religious duties wasn't like forgetting to attend Sunday service. It was social suicide, blasphemy, possibly treason. The gods were always watching, and if your village angered them, famine, flood, plague, war, so you bowed, you gave, you obeyed, and you hoped the gods, or at least their messengers, wouldn't notice you too much. And now, we come to the final stop on our long journey through Mesopotamia, the place where everyone from king to slave eventually arrived: death. But unlike modern beliefs in reward or reincarnation, the Mesopotamians didn't imagine paradise beyond the veil. They expected nothing, or worse. In Mesopotamian mythology, the dead went to the land of no return, a shadowy, silent underworld known as Akkad, not a place of fire and brimstone, not a place of joy, just dust. You didn't feast with ancestors. You didn't relive your glory days. You sat in the darkness, eating dirt, forgotten by the living. The journey to the underworld was grim. You passed through 7 gates, left behind your clothes, your name, your identity, and once you arrived, you simply existed, like a prisoner in an endless grey fog. Unless someone remembered you. This was the one mercy Mesopotamians clung to: remembrance. If your descendants honoured you with offerings, your soul could find some comfort. Beer poured on your grave, bread left out, a name spoken during a festival. That's what kept your spirit from fading into total oblivion. But if you were forgotten, you'd become one of the Adimu, restless spirits, forever wandering, hungry, lost, whispering curses to the living who had let you fade. This is why proper burial was so important. Even the poorest families tried to secure a decent resting place. If they couldn't afford a grave, they might bury their dead under the floor of the house, close enough to remember, close enough to feed. For the wealthy, tombs were filled with trinkets and tools, tokens to appease the gods of the underworld. For the kings, whole retinues were sometimes sacrificed to follow them: servants, animals, chariots, gold. But regardless of wealth or offering, the final truth was always the same. The land of no return waited, and it never gave back. In Mesopotamia, you didn't dream of heaven, you feared being forgotten. So each day, you lived with the quiet knowledge that death wasn't rest, it was exile. And now, the fires burn low. The ancient sky, once so full of dust and ambition, fades into starlight. The noise of markets and prayers, the clatter of carts, the cries of children, all sink into silence. You've walked a long road tonight, barefoot, bone-tired, and wide-eyed, through the very cradle of civilization. You've touched the rough brick of ziggurats, felt the sting of desert winds, eaten the bitter bread of survival, and you've learned why most wouldn't last even a single day in this world. Because Mesopotamia wasn't kind. It was harsh, holy, violent, radiant. It built cities before cities had names. It wrote laws before kings had crowns. It sang hymns to gods whose faces are long forgotten, yet whose shadows linger in the stories we tell, in the alphabets we write, in the way we measure time. This land, now mostly desert and ruin, was once the heartbeat of the world. But like all heartbeats, it quieted. The rivers shifted, the walls crumbled, the gods grew silent, and the people who once whispered in cuneiform now sleep beneath thousands of years of dust. Still, if you press your ear to the past, really listen, you can almost hear them. A lullaby hummed by a priestess in Ur, The last gasp of a soldier on a muddy battlefield near Nineveh. The scratch of a reed stylus as a tired scribe records the rising price of barley. All echoes now, but not gone. Not tonight. Because, for a few soft hours, you brought them back. And somewhere in the quiet dark between sleep and waking, they're still walking with you, hand in hand through the sands of time. So rest now, traveler. Close your eyes. The cradle of civilization has rocked you long. Enough. Sleep deeply, sleep safely, and when you wake, remember the dust.